Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am here with the author of a book that just consumed my whole last weekend, and I am so excited to talk about it. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, my name is Craig Shreve. I'm an author from Toronto, Ontario. This is my second book. My first book, One Night in Mississippi, came out in 2015, and this book, The African Samurai, releases in Canada and the US on August 1st.
It's that's also my birthday book. My birthday is the day after release, so it's also very good timing. um, Before we get into the book itself, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your journey to the book. How did you get interested in this historical figure, and how did you come to the decision to sort of write this historical fictionalized account of his life?
Sure. I actually stumbled across Yasuke's story pretty much by accident. I first came across it from just a short YouTube video. Really didn't have a lot of detail, just kind of referenced him as being the first foreign-born samurai. And I started looking into it. Of course, I was fascinated by that idea, but I was a little bit skeptical of it just because I'd never heard of him before, and I couldn't believe that could be a true story that I had never kind of run into prior to this. And so I started looking into it, and as I started looking into it, I saw that not only was it a true story, but it was so much more amazing than what this kind of short YouTube video had touched on. And so I was kind of instantly drawn in, and of course, right away I saw the potential for a story, but I wasn't, really committed to doing that initially. I was just really doing research more as a matter of interest and just being really kind of taken by this character and his story. But then I think really it was the COVID lockdown that spurred me to, take it to the next step and start writing a story about it. I had way too much time on my hands. Let's just say that.
I That's so interesting to me, because I started this job in October of 2021, and I've been doing interviews since then pretty much. And like 95% of the people that I talk to like still talk about the pandemic as being like a sort of the context and also the impetus for writing the book. And it's like it's fascinating to me just like how many books that this period of time produced, and also like what seemed to me like very internal books too, because
Right.
this is like an epic story, obviously, that takes place like in a historical period that has been like highly romanticized and like depicted a lot in representations. That's like fascinating to a lot of people. But it's told from his perspective in such an internal way. Like he is a very internal person, I think. Like he notices everything around him and considers things very in a very nuanced way before acting. And so could you talk a little bit about maybe how like his perspective evolved?
Sure. I think there's kind of two things to cover there. One is, yeah, certainly probably being in lockdown did influence a lot of his characterization. Just like everyone else, you feel isolated and disconnected. And so that really tied in nicely, actually, to Yasuke, and kind of how he felt during his early days in Japan. The truth is, he didn't face a lot of, Japan at that time, they had very little. Interaction or really knowledge about Africa. So there weren't any of the kind of negative stereotypes that you might think he had to overcome. But really, what he deals with in the book is just this kind of like loneliness and separation. So I think probably some of that maybe comes from writing during a COVID period. But also in terms of his perspective, in my mind, that's really the only reason to write the book. There's lots of nonfiction information out there about Yasuke if you dig for it. But fiction, of course, allows you to step inside of this character's mind and just try to see how he would have felt about things, how he would have, reacted to things, um, because we don't have anything from him in the first person, like a diary or a journal or letters. So we have facts about him, we have observations about him, but we don't know anything about what was going on inside his mind. And so that's really the, I guess, value of being able to kind of examine that perspective through fiction.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. And I think like it kind of does two things. Like it's, it's his personality, like that he notices a lot and sort of has a lot of thoughts about what he encounters in the world. But it's also like a survival strategy too, because he is just a person who is like always in a completely, like, everything he does is unprecedented for him and for people around him, and sort of to be acting in that like totally new milieu all the time has to engender that kind of response, I imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. His circumstances changed drastically, several points throughout his life, and usually quite suddenly. And so the adaptability that he displayed is certainly something that stood out to me as I was kind of learning more about him. And you're right that adaptability doesn't exist without observation. He's obviously very astute at assessing the situation and assessing people and understanding how to make himself valuable. And he kind of demonstrates that quality with multiple people and throughout multiple scenarios. And I think that's really kind of the defining quality that stood out to me is his ability to kind of assess and adapt.
Absolutely. And you do see him do that through a lot of like very complicated relationships. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the missionary context in which he finds himself at the beginning of the story, because Father Valignano is a super interesting figure, and that's a very complex relationship in that there are some sort of aspects that might seem mentorly or paternal or even friendly, but that there also obviously is a huge power dynamic that like kind of also gets in the way of that. So can you talk a little bit about like, yeah, how he navigates these relationships and these power imbalances?
Sure. So Valignano is definitely an interesting character, and um, I did try to avoid. I mean, the idea of missionaries as ultimate villains is almost become a bit of a trope now. So I was trying to avoid that as much as I could, but you also can't avoid the intentional or unintentional the negative impact that they had. So I was trying to kind of walk that line of being clear about that, but without overemphasizing it and turning someone into a villain. So that's why I tried to develop Valignano as someone who kind of stands on both sides of it. He certainly has some harmful impact during his time in Japan and with some of his actions, but for the most part, through positive intentions and through a sincere belief in in his own actions and his own motivations.
Mm. Yeah, he definitely is like a nuanced human being who isn't all villain or all good, And I
Right.
think it is like a sort of interesting depiction of the way that, I guess individual ambitions and attitudes like intersect with these larger institutions that they represent, because he can have whatever intentions he has too, but he does also represent, like something that was a huge colonizing institution at the time too, and so like navigating that is like very complex.
Yeah, and so there are a couple of other lesser Jesuit characters that are involved as well, and so that allows you to kind of show maybe some of the different representations within the church, in that it wasn't a kind of a monolithic approach, I guess, that some people had different ideas about what their mission should be and how they should be going about it.
Hmm. And that is like, I guess, one of like the main tasks of history, right? Is like to sort of like break down these sort of like monolithic ideas that all people thought the same way at the same time. And that's something that you absolutely see in this book. Um, could you also talk a little bit about the relationship between Yasuke and no Nogunapa. No, I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to,
Nobunaga.
because that is also like a really complex relationship that has aspects of mutual respect and mutual understanding, but also other really complicated forces going on too. Yeah, can you talk about that?
Sure. So I guess I'll start by just talking about what kind of what's known. So very clearly there was a deep respect between the two men. Whether that was the case initially or not is uncertain, but it certainly developed. And Yasuke dined regularly with Nobunaga, sometimes alone, and that was considered a great honor and one that was not afforded to many. Um, so I think with that relationship, it developed a little bit differently in the novel than what I had originally expected it. Um, I expected this, of course, to be kind of a story of culture clash, but as I was going through and writing some of the pieces, I started to kind of find these interesting alignments between African and Asian culture that I had never expected to find. Things like, some of their mythologies and beliefs and even some of the practices. And so um, instead of kind of writing a culture clash, the Yasuke and Nobunaga's relationship, I hope, comes across more as two men from very different backgrounds actually learning that they're not as dissimilar as they might have initially expected.
Mm.
So it was kind of interesting to kind of approach that relationship that way.
That is really interesting. Yeah, and I think that it is a like a very touching relationship too. And there are these moments where you see them like sharing parts of their culture and themselves that are like really really lovely. And when you imagine those moments and the parts of their lives that they share, like what kind of research went into that too? Like did you research the various aspects that they relate, you know?
Yeah, so it's research the various aspects of those kind of cultural moments, not necessarily that they occurred in the way they're presented. But Nobunaga is someone who he did have a deep appreciation for Japanese culture and the tea ceremony and no theater and a lot of those things. But he did also have an appreciation for a lot of the kind of foreign goods and foreign customs. He was very interested in the rest of the world, and so it was pretty natural to kind of portray him as someone who was eager to share his own culture, but also eager to learn about Yasuke's. And I think that is really probably what opens the door to that relationship developing.
Mm. Yeah, I think that that's absolutely a play. And I think you also see a sort of like two characters who are also curious about the world, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
And that also
yeah.
brings them together.
And so there's the one scene where and it kind of snuck up on me as I was writing it, but I realized that despite Nobunaga being this incredibly powerful figure, Yasuke's seen more of the world than he has.
Mm.
And so that kind of works its way into one scene. But that was also just kind of an interesting revelation to me as I was writing.
That is really interesting. My gosh. Yeah, and I think that is like there's a certain, um I guess like humility in their his approach too, where he is able to sort of admit these things about himself that like he is with people who are more worldly than him and that they have something to show him. So that is very, very interesting.
Yeah, and Nobunaga is, if you read histories, so one thing I discovered or was reinforced to me, I guess, is that the idea of unbiased history is a relatively recent development. So as you go back to medieval times, the way that people are portrayed is kind of all over the map, depending on whether it's from a supporter or an opponent. So you can read the stories about Nobunaga where they talk about him as being an actual demon, and then you read other stories that talk about him as being like a very progressive nation builder, instituted a lot of important reforms. And so truth is probably somewhere in between, or maybe both are true. But he did certainly seem progressive in the sense of acknowledging people's talents regardless of their class, and not just with Yasuke, but with others as well. He had elevated a number of people who, didn't necessarily come from the highest ranking families and et cetera. So, in that component, at least, he seems quite progressive.
Mm. That's a really good point you made about the nature of the historical sources too, because I think when you take any figure who was not only like influential in history, but who engendered a lot of like strong feelings in people, whether they were good or bad, like you do have to do a lot of more work with the sources to get beyond the agenda of the people writing them. I often think about that too when I watch the news now. It's like, what in 500 years, like how are
Mm,
you know, like how are people
right.
going to reconstruct the personalities of like our political figures, and stuff like that. Um, so yeah, like when you approach those sorts of conflicting accounts, and then, you know, do you find yourself, I guess, thinking about the I guess the identity of the source writer, something like that? Mhm.
Somewhat, yes. I guess, at one point I was researching stuff on Nobunaga and I had to stop and I was like, wait, is he the villain? I was worried that maybe this story wasn't going to go in the direction I wanted it to, but then, I started to read some other material that was kind of more supportive. But I also, I didn't want to shy away. There's some horrible things that he did do that I kind of reference. The burning of a temple as one of the kind of things that he's unfortunately quite famous for. But so I didn't want to shy away from the fact that I guess to your point, I want to make sure that I'm not judging people by today's standards, and that I'm kind of judging them by their contemporary standards. It was a violent time, and people did violent things, including good people. And so, again, kind of walking the line of not shying away from that, but also not vilifying people. So, yeah, there was a lot of examination of um, material within the appropriate context, I guess.
Hmm. Interesting, cool. Um, it's interesting to me too that Yasuke has figured in like pop culture in a couple of manifestations lately, most recently in an anime on Netflix. Um, do you think he's been he is such a fascinating figure because of what we know about him, or because in the gaps of what we know about him?
That's an interesting question. And it's probably some of both, I guess. When you just give somebody the 10-second pitch and say, yeah, he's a 16th century East African slave who became the first foreign-born samurai, that grabs everybody's interest right away. So certainly, I think he's a figure of interest because of that, because you hear that and you want to know more. Um, but yeah, I know I was talking to someone else recently, and I said that I do hope that um, other people write about him and other people do stories about him, because there is a lot of room for interpretation. As I said earlier, we have the observations of him and we have like names, dates, facts, but his internal world was, a mystery. And so I took a shot at it, but there are other ways you could go with the story and other ways you could go with the character, and I would love to see other kind of interpretations. I'd like to see him be kind of a mainstream character.
Mm, yeah, I think there's just so much there to mine, and he's such a good example, I think, also of ways in which the study of this period of history is changing right now. 'Cause before I became a librarian, I was a historian, and like history, the way that we talk about either medieval or early modern history in general is getting a lot more global, and we're seeing that these worlds weren't as like fragmented as
Right.
perhaps thought they were. And I think that following his path across like multiple continents in the 16th story is such a good illustration of like how actually like interconnected this world was.
Sure. And stumbled across, whenever you're doing research, you always end up falling down some rabbit holes and getting off track. So certainly, I discovered that as well. I mean, the Roman Empire seems like it was one of the most diverse empires that maybe we've seen. They had spread so far and wide that people from, what a good chunk of the known world had made their way to Rome or Rome adjacent areas, I guess, and is particularly in port cities, it seems. Populations were quite diverse with people, workers coming in and out from all over the world, and then of course I stumbled across stories of black cowboys and black Vikings and black conquistadors, and so it's interesting to see that um, there's a lot more shared history maybe than what we currently believe.
Mm. Do you think that you'll return to historical fiction? Do you have plans to stay writing about overlooked figures in the past, or do you what are your plans?
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting area to explore. I overlooked figures, and also I really enjoyed writing about kind of the cultural intersection. So stories kind of that touch on that or stay in that thematic area are of interest to me. So I have a few ideas kicked around, I guess. So I'm not exactly sure what's next, but I do think that that's an area I'd like to continue to explore.
Very cool. Well, I hope that you'll consider coming back to the show with your future projects, because it was really lovely to speak to you today. And, I thought this book was just like such a really a lovely treat. Like the writing was gorgeous, and Yasuke is such a lovely figure to spend time with. So thank you for bringing him to us.
Well, thank you for those comments, and thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, very welcome. Listeners, please check out The African Samurai. It'll be available by the time that you hear this podcast. So please hit up your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go for those things. Thanks so much for listening. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.